We're now in week 2 in rural valuation. And in this week, I would like you to start thinking about the land as an important part of the rural enterprise, the rural valuation. This should be pretty obvious. However, once you're working in an urban environment where we're valuing houses and shops and office blocks and so on, we tend to forget that the land is important. And so in this module, what we're going to do is basically do some fairly easy reading, especially if you live in regional Australia. All of this stuff should be pretty obvious. But it's important to actually set this as a foundation. And so reading through the study guide this week is very, very important. I'll just go over some of the concepts that we're likely to find. You'll find it all laid out pretty clearly in chapters 2 and 4 in the textbook. Let's look at what's important in the land. The important thing about any type of farming, whether it's agriculture or grazing, and so on, is that you're using the land to produce something alive, usually based on vegetation. So even if you're running cattle, you can't run cattle without grass, and so you're really growing grass to sell it as beef. How do we get grass to grow? We need good soil, we need sunshine, and we need the right climate. Those things tend to be located quite specifically on different farms. Even on a single farm, you'll find that the situations can change. And I think we introduced this last week. What are the dimensions? Well, the first thing we want to look at is what we call the topography. Topography is the lay of the land, how steep it is mainly, and it can also include other characteristics of the land. But overall, is it dead flat river plains? Is it mountainous side of the Warrumbungle somewhere? Or is it somewhere in between, nice undulating hills and so on? We talk about the topography in terms primarily of grade, how steep the land is, and we can express grade either in terms of degrees of slope or as a percentage of rise over run. And in the reading list in the study guide, there are the general character. Now, you're not going to be going out measuring slope with a clino or anything like that. That's a surveyor's job. But it's useful if you can look at the land and say, yes, that's pleasant undulating land, or that's a bit steep for this, that, and the other, or that's boringly flat. Oddly enough, boringly flat land is often the most productive because it suits agricultural machinery, whether you're growing either wheat out west or sugarcane or what have you. And sometimes the opposite suits other crops, and it's a matter of looking further into that as your interest develops. And so topography is the first issue. It's possible to get topographical maps known as topo maps, and they can be a very useful foundation for your inspections and so on. Land zones are an important way of classifying the land. So we talk about coastal land, we talk about western plains, and so on. And so we have quite a series of zones. Now, these really define the overall productivity and often give us a bit of a hint as to the soil type, the type of vegetation that's likely to be able to grow on them. In the study guide, there is a list. It runs from things like the coastal lands, which can be coastal dunes, which are simply big piles of sand with a little bit of grass growing on top, right out to rocky desert and so on, and a number of different types in between. It's useful to be able to spot different types of rocks and so on, and the different type of dominant rock underneath the land. If you go out in a field inspection and are able to observe that it's granite soil or basalt area or sandstone or just simply plain boring sandy, that's very helpful because it helps you to look like you know what you're talking about. And this comes into the area of soils. soils are probably the most important thing. And conserving soils is extraordinarily important. No point in ploughing up your land, having some kind of a tempest come through and blow all your soil away, because it's very hard to get it back. And this has happened in various parts of Australia at different times, and it still continues to happen on occasions when the weather goes very badly for us. Soil is actually made up of more than dirt, I guess. It's not simply weathered rocks, although the mineral particles form really the foundation. In addition to weathered rock material, weathered minerals, soil also contains organic material, and so that's usually from dead and decaying organic material, dead animals, dead plants, probably more. You'll find soil will have water in it, so the moisture levels in soil extremely important. There'll be air within soil, and oddly enough, there's a fair bit of living material. There are roots and so on, there's fungus, there are animals, worms and so on, bacteria, beetles and bugs. There's quite a variety of things. So when we look at soil, to get soil, it's not simply, if you like, one single stuff. It's really a conglomerate of a number of different substances, and they all work together. If you leave any of them out, the soil won't be quite as good, and you see this in the less productive soils. By and large, we talk about the different types of soils. The ideal is a well-structured clay, preferably with a good amount of organic material in it, and that gives you a soil which is neither rock hard nor sandy and easy to blow away and so on. There are a number of different types of clay. Clay is simply a description for finely weathered mineral material. That's like pure clay. Then we have loams, sandy loams, where we're having more of the large silica granules, sand, in them, and of course sandy soils. So what we need is to first of all identify it and be able to observe that what is the soil type on your property, and beware that you can't simply drive past one property and say, well, the one across the road or up the street or over the hill is going to be the same, and therefore I'll use this comparable. If it turns out that the soil on your property is different to the soil on your comparable properties, you're talking about chalk and cheese. Okay, read through the study guide. It will give you some of the background. One of the hints, one of the big advantages, the shortcuts in identifying the soils is to develop a bit of a familiarity with what kinds of natural vegetation grow on particular soil types. And so this match between natural vegetation and the soil, actually the vegetation tells you probably a lot more than simply the soil. It tells you the soil, it tells you the local climate, which is very, very important. And so you might have the same soil on two different sides of the hill, but because the climate will be a little tiny bit different, the vegetation can be different. But being aware of the natural vegetation, that's been taken to quite a science, a area of science called geobotanic indicators, where geologists use the natural vegetation to give us a little bit of a hint as to what the geology is underneath the ground. And so they can fly over, or now use satellites, remote sensing, look at the vegetation, and from the vegetation they'll say, oh, if we look under there we might find gold, if we look under there we might find something else. So the valuer is definitely has an advantage if you develop this familiarity with the natural vegetation. We're going to be dealing with vegetation as a separate issue. Obviously, farmers often take out the natural vegetation so that they can put something more productive in, but the natural vegetation still remains as an important hint, if you like. Ultimately, the land is valued largely on the quality of its soil. We've mentioned climate a number of times. The climate is also important. I mentioned, which side of the hill you're on and so on, and that can quite have a major impact. The temperature, the amount of frost, the amount of rainfall, all of those things will have an impact on what can be grown. Depending on where you are, is really what element of the climate, what aspect of the climate is probably going to be dominant. And so in some cases, it might be simply the overall rainfall. In other cases, it might be issues like frost. It could be prevailing winds and so on. Again, it's good to consider these issues. Obviously, to study them in detail requires a lot more study than we're going to be doing in one term. But if you like, it opens the box for you. So read through the study guide and through the chapter, and that will give you, if you like, a solid introduction to what is probably the most important single natural aspect of the property we're going to be valuing.